The current landscape is daunting and seems to change every day. It's like we get up and we think one thing's happening, and then we read the paper or turn on the radio or check our calendars, and nothing is as it was. And it seems like we're settling into a daily routine that is always subject to change. And that's what we're here to explore. My name is Ann Hamilton. Let's make some sense of it.
And I'm Johanna Burton. I'm the director of the Wexner Center for the Arts here in Columbus, Ohio. We'll be spending the coming weeks talking to a variety of artists, thinkers, and creators about their work and their practice these past few months in the face of what are twin health crises of COVID-19 and systemic racism. When we first started thinking about doing this series, I think we had an idea of how upending the world felt and upended the world felt, but it's increasingly been the case. And so as Anne says, we're here to just kind of talk about what it feels like to be in the midst of it.
And I'm joining Johanna in these conversations really about what is it that artists do? What is the nature of practice and process? And both of those have been, for most people, upended in some ways. And they're asking huge questions individually of what artists are doing and how they're doing it, and what the collaboration and responsibility of the arts institutions that have been central to the ecosystem for the arts in the culture. What is the work and how is the work that we all need to be doing as the landscape and the questions are constantly shifting?
In the spirit of this series and how we're approaching it, it's probably important to say that we're in the middle of taping a pilot episode for a series that we actually started a couple of months ago. The first episode that we taped, introducing subject to change, itself became subject to change because the world moved so quickly. So let's talk a little bit about that, Anne. I mean, we're reintroducing something that, cheekily we said, oh, well, we don't have a handle on the world. So let's talk about what it means for artists and for those who support artists to kind of think about that condition. And then it itself, I think, several times even since that point has shifted. So I'm trying to remember the first time that we actually sat down to do exactly what we're doing today was, I think in April, is that correct, of 2020? So something like 7 months ago, maybe it was a little less. We had shut down the Wexner Center because of COVID, like many, many other institutions, cultural institutions and otherwise. And we were trying to grapple with what that meant and think about the conditions. And again, trying to be generous, I think, to ourselves and to others, that this is a predicament that's obviously profoundly disconcerting, and there's a lot of pain and there's a lot of challenges, but that it's also a space that artists thrive in to some degree when supported, really thinking about uncertainty. But then we found that we needed to recast for ourselves this pilot. So this is a sort of midway pilot moment. We've actually had 6 really great conversations with artists up to this point. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But I think we wanted to both take the opportunity to say, when things are really changing, why not acknowledge it and talk about it? So here we are reshooting the pilot, and it feels very different.
Yeah. Well, and I think that when we started, I think we all felt the urgency to have some sort of answer or some sort of clear response, or like this impulse to fix things. And then I think, on the other hand, there's been this need to suspend into this pause and how the need to act and the need to listen and pause. I feel like we're still very much suspended in that. The conversations we've had, I think the first conversation was with theater director Anne Bogart. And we really focused on having conversations with artists who have collaborated in new works with the Wexner Center for the Arts. And it seemed very important to begin with artists for whom that collaboration with an institution has made work possible. And that work has been a response to the conditions that are very unique to the Wexner, that become resources that make a work that wouldn't otherwise happen. So now we're at a moment where What the Wexner and the university can offer is really being examined, and the nature of the work that is made to respond to this condition is changing. And so with Anne Bogart and then also Anne Carlson, who'd also done a performance-based collaborative piece with the Wexner and Ohio State University, both of them, their work happens with live audiences. And that's a really particular condition about how, when you don't have the theater, when you don't have live bodies in space sharing time, then what happens to performance, which has so much gone to the screen? And are there any silver linings in that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting too, as I was getting ready for today, I to your point exactly, I remembered that the first time that we convened, I tried to, I set myself up in a situation where I was in an office and it looked like I was, ready to have a conversation that would happen in at that point, what was still everyday cadence. And today I find myself sitting, in my bed, because that's where over the last 6 months, I have found a quiet place while my child homeschools in the other room and my spouse is doing another job. And there's a way in which we were kind of fervently trying to approximate something that was receding. And I do think it's been interesting. And I think the artists that we've talked to and the figures we've talked to have also allowed for that space, which is not altogether comfortable around this unknowing, to again produce a different kind of temporality. I also think people are exhausted, and so there's a new level of wanting to stop approximating one kind of pace. Although when I talk with people, and I think we've found this with the artists too, they're busier than ever, and but they're not busy in the ways that necessarily they can habitually occupy. And so I think watching that shift has been really interesting. And I think, again, for myself as the director of the WEX, as we move into this next era, and to your point, historically, well before I was in Ohio, what has been so great about the institution has been its willingness to provide a platform for an artist at a moment where what they really need is space and time to experiment. We often call the WEX a laboratory for contemporary art. And I'm more dedicated than ever to kind of reinstituting some of that premise and making it central, where, you offer an artist a show or an event, a performing arts event, or even a film screening. What does it look like to say, how could you do that? Or how might we support you in a way that you can't in other presenting institutions? So I think part of what our discussion and what's been so meaningful to me is I'm kind of using this as research to figure out, when we do come out, whatever it is, to come out the other side of this, and whatever the conditions are, what do artists need right now? So that's something I want to talk to you about. You haven't slowed down at all, even though, as we've spoken about, the conditions are really changed. What do you feel like an institution can do for an artist? And how have your experiences at the WEX maybe informed the way in which, and the WEX and other places you've shown all over the world, obviously, but this is your hometown museum, and what can we be doing, and how can we be supporting artists at this moment most meaningfully?
Well, it's interesting, Johanna, because I feel like we're in this big unknowing together.
Yeah.
And then maybe it isn't so much about what do arts institutions that are as nimble as the Wexner really need to do for artists. What do artists need? But like more to how do we recast that question? What do we need to do together? Because I feel like we're in the process of trying to figure out if we're even asking the right question.
Right.
And then understanding, well, maybe we don't know what the question is yet that really emerges from this moment, but it's like, how do we work together to find a process where that can be recognized when we do find it? And so I think, I think the most important thing right now is that when I think about art and artists and what we do, I think work comes from work, making comes from making. And when there's no platform, opportunity, invitation, whether that's to talk like this or to exhibit or perform or whatever, that then I think you're just thinking about the idea of doing something, and the real work comes from the doing. And so I think any invitation to contribute to something, it actually makes all the difference right now. And of course, you know, if we can fund that too, that's also really great. I mean, personally, in my own work, it's funny. I woke up in the middle of this time and find that I'm doing more and more permanently cited public artworks. And so that's been a real shift from very ephemeral kind of site responsive projects that have a very particular duration. And these permanent public projects go on for a lot longer. You know, they have 3 and 5, and I'm just working on a piece that started 10 years ago right now. So it's an interesting moment when we're all thinking about public space and civic space, and what does it mean to come together when we can't, you know, when we actually can't be physically in the same space. All those questions were already circulating in the work that I was beginning to do. So I feel very lucky in the sense that the challenges of that work is keeping me really busy along with teaching. But I think that, like a lot of artists, you know, and maybe the impulse behind this series is to share what the actual process of coming to form is, or what the actual process of coming to one's question. How does work actually happen? That so often what is shared is the thing that's the result, or the end of that process, and not, as you know, institutionally, all the conversations that go on curatorially around a project, and this collaboration with artists trying to solve the problems so that it actually can become public, so that it can be shared.
Right.
And so I think the impulse is to, for in the interviews and talking with the artists that we've talked to so far, is to probe at that and like open that up, that what is what is the process, which is often really articulate, through which work comes to articulation or to form. And I think that those questions aren't so different than the ones the institutions are asking themselves right now. There isn't, I think, an art museum or art center that isn't saying, whoa, things are changing really fast, and what do we need to be doing?
Right. I'm really glad you made that segue, because I feel like, you know, this is my first run as a museum director, but I've spent my life working in museums and believing in museums, believing in the dictate that there should be public platforms upon which, you know, art is supported and placed and observed and protected, and that those are spaces that should be spaces of disagreement, but meaningful disagreement. And now I think we are seeing, really just in literally the time since I arrived and assumed this new post, we're seeing that the progression of you know, institutional questioning at a new level. And again, you know, one of the reasons that we wanted to retape this you know, this early segment was that, you know, as much as we were thinking about COVID, the kind of questions that have come out of social inequity are looming really so large, and they are pressuring institutions to not just become transparent, but to really ask what their purpose is in a new way. And I think even these questions around collecting, what does it mean to protect an object? From who, for who, by who? They're really looming large, and the Wexner, I think, has this opportunity, as do a lot of institutions, but I think we're a particular kind of support mechanism. We don't collect. You know, people often wonder what the sort of mission is, and it's to really mostly work with living artists in real time, to ask those questions, but also, to your point, to understand that the progression of working with an artist doesn't just allow for an artist to change or for that practice to change, it allows for the institution to change too. And that sounds and is very exciting, but it also demands that there's work happening infrastructurally, ideologically, intellectually, emotionally. And I certainly find myself having those conversations with my staff, with artists who come in and actually want to know how we work, how we work. So is it an okay place for them to work? And I think those incongruities are becoming, I think in many cases, really positive material for conversations, but they can also be paralyzing and really sometimes there isn't the possibility of sort of moving forward. So, we brought in Dina Hagag, who is the director of USA Artists, and you're on the board there, and who spoke a little bit about just shifting expectations. What does support mean? And in many cases, singular artists, solitary artists don't want to be thought about as single entities anymore. They want to be thought of more collectively in the way that I think a lot of discussion around social equity is happening. And so it's interesting as we get further and further into this series that the questions are, and I'm very ready always to say, what do artists need? What do artists want? How can I help artists? But you're right to say, how do we make something new together? And how do we do it without getting rid of everything that's good? And so again, to bring it back to this question of making together, I feel like the WEX has been around for 30 years now, and it was premised on this idea of multidisciplinary proximity being really a rich way for artists to, I think in new ways and for them to be supported as they made. But I'm wondering for the next sort of era, beyond the kind of multidisciplinary promise, how we also extend this question to the public. And, you brought up, sort of the public sphere, and I often, not originally in any way, but talk about how, the two outdated institutions, were libraries and museums, and libraries figured it out. Libraries have become these civic centers where people recognize their sort of core as living in some kind of knowledge, but they've upended this idea that it's knowledge that's simply produced and mapped onto people. And people have aggressively reutilized the space of the library. Yeah. And so how does the museum do something like that? I was just reading an article by a museum director who said, maybe we can't, maybe we've sort of reached the end of the line. I don't believe it's true. I come from a place of wanting to join institutions to make them better. But I also do think there's a radical suggestion that it's not enough just to sort of gently sort of tweak things, right? We have to be revolutionary to some degree, but how that happens, I think you're right. It has to be, there has to be an alignment with artists who are asking the questions and having the institutions be asking them too.
Well, I think it's interesting that you bring up the library, because I do think I've always thought, well, and at our OSU, the main library and the Wexner face each other across this big public open space. And I think the ways in which the libraries, public and university libraries, have become really social spaces. Right. And I think of them as really being civic spaces where you cross with all sorts of things and people that are there for all different reasons. And especially you see that in public libraries. Right. And yet, on the other hand, it also offers a kind of sanctuary and a place of contemplation and study and, in some cases, really singular focus. And so, and I think, so what does that mean if you sort of think about the arts institution in that way? Like, how is it both that offer that kind of sanctuary and that quietude and that relationship to work that's like out of the everyday, and at the same time keep you in the everyday and in the engagement with all the enormous issues that we have in front of us. And I think in that, it's like just as artists, I think right now are trying to figure out in their own practices, what and how is their activism part of the actual work? And in what way does it inform their form? Or how is it part of artists as citizens you know, participating. And I think I think that a lot of us have a confusion about what we expect from the work itself.
Yeah.
And what do we think that art can actually do? You know, I'm very leery of it being instrumentalized in a way and explained away, you know, that it's just a tool, you know, for a certain position or ideology. And so I think, you know, I think a lot about what are the forms for work that actually in themselves have a politic. Mm-hmm. That sometimes that there's a confusion of subject matter and form and how they carry meaning. And so that's what's really interesting. You know, I'm thinking about the conversation with B.B. Miller that we had, and with Carmen Winant, both of whom I think in different ways are talking about the way their values and belief systems are embodied in the forms they choose to work in, and that those have an inherent sociability and social legibility. You know, I think the thing about museums or a place like the Wexner that doesn't collect, but how does it need to remake? It's partly, first, how do you recognize what we are or what you are and what its strengths are? And how do you work from those strengths? Because there's like the condition of everything in the world, climate change, social equity, you know, all these disparities, the pandemic. And then there's and those obviously affect everything about what's close at hand. But then there's also we need to look at what are the resources that we have right here with and among each other, and what can we make from that? Just like I think in Anne Bogart's conversation, we came up that, well, the first theater, the first stage is a piece of cloth on the ground. And so right now, what is it when we have architectural spaces? What do they need, or how do they need to be doing what they can do?
Yeah.
That just sounds incredibly vague, doesn't it?
No, it doesn't. I mean, interestingly, you know, I love the architecture of the Wex, but as everyone knows who's been in it, it is famously problematic for being, you know, a kind of high postmodernist, you know, a structure that in many ways questioned comfort. So when Peter Eisenman made this building, right, it was a building that you could not, as an artist, not contend with when you were working in it. And it's interesting now to look at something that in a way is very modest compared, I think, to a lot of the museum architecture that's happening now. And in a funny way, is a case study for what it meant to insist that you experience art in a real space, in real time, and you know, in a funny way to make it hard. Although many artists, when they come in and actually spend time, yourself included, find that space actually really gratifying, because the problem is on the surface. You know, it doesn't pretend to be neutral. It doesn't pretend to be any of these things. But I will say, the reason I'm bringing the building up now is that it did not account for the kind of public space that we're talking about. So I find myself in this really interesting, like, just to talk really kind of boring brass tacks, we don't really have a lobby where people can hang out and come in to just see each other, or to be there and experience things even before they go in to see a performance, or they go in to see a gallery exhibition. So there's this kind of really interesting way in which there's the kind of practical aspect of any space. And then there is the overwhelmingly, you know, kind of, again, ideological construct. And I've always found it really fascinating that contemporary art, which one reason I was drawn to it is that contemporary artists really tell us, they're barometers for what's happening in the world. So they're the closest to the ground in terms of thinking about social issues, thinking about ways to kind of access the present. Contemporary art is often seen as the most alienating form. And this kind of paradox that we find ourselves in today, where I sort of want to throw those doors open and say, this is for all of you, but we haven't done a good enough job of doing that. And I don't think it's I don't think it has anything to do with the way that the artworks themselves speak. You know, we just this year featured an amazing installation by LaToya Ruby Frazier that took up the local conditions of GM workers as their unions were pressured and their factories were being closed. And when people got inside the building, they said, here's this thing. Actually, my father worked in that plant, or my grandfather was part of a union, or, these were stories that spoke to everybody. But there's such an interesting, and I still am trying to wrap my head around, again, using the maybe library as an example. These are forms that are for everybody, but there's an idea, there are ways in which we have produced a situation where people don't feel welcome.
Right.
And so it's a long way of saying, I think what you're bringing up is really interesting. And I've been thinking recently about 20 years ago, that kind of high-low debates, which have receded a little bit in terms of the kind of language and vocabulary, but that there was high art and then there was popular culture. And I'm not so sure that's where we are anymore. It's a different binary where, one needn't necessarily have to choose, I think, between speaking to a wider public and also being extremely, well-trained in a particular discipline. So back to BB, for instance, right? Here's a choreographer and a dancer who's so finely crafted in her form, and yet pretty much anybody can enter. I think the movements that she makes. And in fact, she was just here at the Wex, working in our space while it was closed with Paul Lazar from Big Dance Theater. So cracking open historical, in this case, they were redoing a piece that Paul obviously had done for years around John Cage, and really kind of thinking about what was implicit in this, what kind of implicit privilege, what kind of implicit discussions could be had by bringing a second dancer and a woman of color, in fact, into that work. So, I don't know. I feel like I'm kind of rambling on, but rather than making it any clearer, I guess I just wanted to articulate that the architecture problem is one that has layers beyond the buildings themselves in a way that's really interesting. And I can't build a lobby tomorrow, so I'm not quite sure how to do it.
Yeah, and I would be really curious, Johanna, with the artists that you're working on in the upcoming exhibitions, and this will be a question we'll really take into maybe the next conversations with artists, the degree to which they're really thinking about the space, the architectural space, and the way that architectural space sits in a larger social space, and to what degree the work is actually responding to that. Because you can't change, it's just like you can't change your body. You still have two arms and whatever. But it's like, but it is this moment of like, well, what is possible within this? This is an enormous cavity, right? And so what do we need to do with it? And so I think, who are the artists that are really exploring that? I think so many of the impulses have also been to, like Ann Carlson, get on the back of a flatbed truck and take her performances to the public or to someone's driveway, and to take the work out. And I think we're in this moment where, it's both reaching in to reanimate or think about what needs to be happening inside that can happen inside the space, but also what are the ways in which it's actually about leaving that space, and what does that actually mean for, a program that has really been tied to its structure and its place within a university. And I think that its place within a university is really, maybe its immediate community, but it's helping. I think the Wexner is also the vehicle to really work in the city beyond the university community.
I mean, I come from a place where, I always existed in these sort of hybrid curatorial education roles where, for years, I think a lot of this sort of outside work, this community work, was tasked, the education departments were tasked with this work. And I think we're seeing a shift. I hope we're seeing a shift where that department shouldn't be seen as a kind of secondary, the department that makes that makes it easier for people to understand the other departments. And and so, you know, in my previous post at the New Museum, I was a curator, but I ran the education department. And how I did that was to work really closely with artists who wanted to work really closely with a museum. So rather than just coming in and installing a show, they wanted to use that time to further their own research. They wanted to intersect with community. They wanted students to be involved in their projects. These weren't things that they had to do. They came to us because that was part of how they liked to work, but couldn't always find a place to do it. And that was incredibly impactful on me, to see how there was this kind of engine that was a big part of the programmatic structure of the place, but was also sort of leaning into what it meant to really think about education in a serious way. So, you know, the Wexner's always had a really strong education program, but we've made it really kind of an equal fourth partner to the other disciplines, and we've renamed it Learning and Public Practice. And Deanne Custer-Edwards, who's been at the Wex for 15 years, is now the head of that department. And that's she and her team, Jean Pittman and others, are out doing that work, even when we can't. There's a really kind of, for me, very meaningful way in which they've not only continued with school programs, but actually deepened them during this moment where it's harder and harder, you know, for people to even know where kids are when they're doing things like online or hybrid learning. Some of them don't have access to these things. And I think, you know, for myself, this question of how to migrate some of that kind of practice into other areas is the sweet spot, where that work doesn't just happen in the spot that's demarcated as education. It's the heart of the work. And I guess one thing that's always really interesting to me, and maybe I can ask you this question, is there's been a lot of debate over the years, you know, questions of how do you gauge the impact of an artist's work, and this idea of artists as workers, and how are they paid, and how do we think of their labor? And so, you know, this question of what is an artist's job right now? Like if I invite an artist into the Wexner, what task am I asking them to do? Or is there another way that we can invite people in which the idea of the job is sort of both, I think, highlighted. It is a job. It is your job. That is what you do. But also what is my job as a museum director, or somebody for whom that becomes a really important question. So I don't know, what is your job? How would you, when people ask you when you're on a plane, what's your job? Do you say I'm an artist?
I usually say I'm a teacher.
Okay.
That's such a good question. I mean, I can only speak from my own experience, but I know when I enter a conversation, like with like a Wexner Center or another place where I'm working, I feel like my job is to first understand what's there, like in all of its variety. And then I feel like my job is to find the question that it needs to be asked. It's almost like, what is here that needs to come to the surface? Mm-hmm. And then that's what's going to fuel the work. And sometimes it's just like a big, huge question, but it comes from what is already there. And so I use the word need, like, what does this place need? Or what needs asking? Or what do we need to see? And then somehow in my mind that what you're asking is mixed in my thinking with a conversation I've been having with some of the students recently about, sometimes we make assumptions, like we might assume the gallery space, or we assume what a studio is, but to really have them ask themselves, what are the conditions that your work actually needs to be shared? And maybe it isn't any of the models that already exist.
Right. And
so in the same way, how do the programs actually respond to what the work needs, rather than, kind of public programming that sometimes gets grafted on to making work that exists accessible or inviting people in or open, but it's more, how do the conditions of the work itself generate the work that needs to be done?
Yeah. It's really, I'm going to show myself to be the Freudian that I am here, but I do think there's often a lot of confusion about between what does the work need and what does the work want. And often what we assume we want is a thing that we already know, or something that strives for a certain kind of level of ambition or public acknowledgement. But want and need are really different. Need is the thing that you have to meet kind of honestly, and it may not be the thing you want, actually. I wonder sometimes about, especially in a moment socially where we should really be thinking about need. And art is often left outside of this conversation of need because it's assumed that it's above and beyond. It's something that's supplementary to need. I've been having a lot of discussions about this with funding, right? Like I'm out trying to raise dollars to support artists at a moment when people are losing their jobs. And we are seeing how the racial inequity and gendered inequity and all kinds of things, class inequity, have people struggling to feed themselves and their families. But without in any way discounting that, because I think that's the condition we're in. I think without creativity, people can't imagine themselves in other situations, and often it's a tool, whether they learn it from someone else or they just experience it, where it's symbolic, and the idea of being able to kind of think outside of your present conditions it's more crucial than ever. But I do think this question of need is super interesting because it's not always the answer you want. And it's not the thing you necessarily go looking for either.
I feel like, when I start a project, I'm always I feel like I'm like the dog circling and not sure where to sit, and like watching its tail and going, what is this one going to do to me? But I think, in some ways it's like, well, so how do we justify art, which is so often seen as being, as you say, an extra and not a fundamental need, like food is a fundamental need, and housing and healthcare and all the things that we can list. But, culture is made everywhere. And I think it's part of how we hold on to hope.
Yeah.
And that we wither without that. So even if we're well fed. So, I think it's partly about how do we reach into those places in culture where culture is being made every day. People are writing poetry that probably don't even know they're writing poetry.
Yeah.
And so it seems like maybe one of the tasks of the arts institutions right now is to help us see those things that are actually being made that aren't necessarily the places where the lens has been or the recognition has been cast. And, I'm thinking, because it's also such a moment where there's been such a hierarchy of privileging something that is international, and traveling, and not necessarily looking at where and what the culture that we're actually physically in the middle of. And I think that's going to change a lot of the ways that programming begins to grow, maybe from a different soil. And I don't feel very articulate about that, but I'm thinking about the history, the history of what we call the craft traditions. And, all of those are embedded in something being transformed, some material being transformed, it going from one sort of state into another state. And that's something, whether you're sweeping up dirt, and you're watching that pile accumulate, that I think we all have such a fundamental need to participate in some sort of process of transformation, because that's also, that's self-transformation too. And so where do we recognize and hold on to it, and in recognizing it, give it value?
Well, and I think, it's interesting. There's been, I think to until pretty recently, people thought that you either focused on the local, and in that case you ran a community center, or you focused on the national and international, in which case you were, a kind of leading, like a serious art museum. And I think those choices don't have to be made anymore. And that's what's really exciting to me, is that there are artists, to your point, there are artists everywhere. And I think, you know, I'll tell this story because I think it's interesting. We just recently worked with Tamashi Jackson, who is a very, now, I think, kind of rising star, well-known painter, who shows regularly in New York and LA, who wanted to work at the Wex for the reasons that that we talked about, kind of understanding the depth model, but also because she is really interested in Ohio as a space for really kind of a case study for the suppression of Black voters. And during this election cycle, really wanted to think about redlining and gerrymandering and the specificity of this place. Could not travel here, though she wanted to be with us. And so did all of the work remotely with our staff, who did did a huge amount of work to enact some of the research and interviews that she needed facilitated. And though she never stepped foot in Columbus, she had, and we had, an incredibly generous and generative back and forth with her. So, and she's not local, but I think she will always have a relationship to this place now that was about what she needed in her work at that moment, but also how we could facilitate and enable that project. So it's really interesting. I think, again, the porosity of those conversations is really moving to me at the moment, and to see that those boundaries are there. I mean, on the other hand, you know, and I've seen this before, like, you get plenty of people who are actually just interested in seeing their work go up. And so, you know, they may or may not come to install, but it may not matter which museum it's in. And I think I'm less interested in perpetuating that model, and really kind of thinking about this opportunity, not always so literally, right, to focus on the place, but to think about the specificity of the experience, and not just for the artists, but for this place when they come.
Yeah, I think, and maybe that's something to circle back to why we're having these conversations, and all the artists that were interested in how they work, what their processes are, how they think about their practice, how that's changing at this moment and being shifted. But we're interested, I think we're interested in actually work that comes out of relations. And so, you know, you didn't start with a picture of what you thought an exhibition project with Tamashi would look like, but it really grew from a conversation, and it grew from cultivating trust. It grew from you helping connect her to people in the community in different ways. And so I would say that that's actually maybe most characteristic of what the Wexner is trusting the process of that relationship developing, that it will come to form, that actually it established relationships in locally and elsewhere that wouldn't happen otherwise, except that they're generated by this process. And again, I think about, to bring up Ann Carlson again, you know, her project, which was based around food systems, and everyone who participates in different ways in food systems. I mean, she had a map of Columbus that I certainly didn't know, and touched all different kinds of communities, you know, from the food bank to the local farmers, to the executive chef, to the food supplier, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it was because she had a question, and she had a process through which she could bring all these different conversations together into one space. And to me, when I think about that project, Symphonic Body, I think it's such a model for a way of working, and it's ways of working that I think we hope to expose in Always Subject to Change.
So we're probably getting close to the end of our pilot, which was really, it's always nice to just talk about what we're doing, and to also experiment in real time. I know that we're getting ready to launch the first few episodes, which again have already been taped, starting in December, every Tuesday, once a week for for a few months. And we hope, my dream is that, you know, and by partnering with our great friends at WOSU, that this is the kind of topic that whether you are just interested in art in a kind of in a habitual way, or one that you're just, or starting to have an interest that's deeper, that there's something interesting to you and might pique your interest, both about the artists themselves, but also about I think what our question is, which is how do you tap into this kind of uncertainty and process at a moment where it can feel really overwhelming, but also it allows for conversations that are maybe unique and will be a kind of picture of their time.
Yeah, you know, Johanna, that's really beautiful. And it makes me think about that all acts of making really rely on trusting, in some ways not knowing where you're going. And that it's the acts of doing it. It's the act of putting the show together. It's the act of thinking about what kind of institution you can be, what kind of city you're in. And it's like, how do you cultivate that trust of not knowing what something is while that's going on? And I think, you know, we live in a culture where it's very hard to trust that space. And it's very important right now that we cultivate and really give permission for that, because none of us actually know exactly where we're going.
No.
And how different things will be when we're on the other side of whatever that means. So
I agree. And, you know, I just want to mark as I look outside that when we started talking about this, it was spring and we didn't know how long things would go on or what they would look like. And today is the first snowfall here.
Yeah. Get your sweater.
Get your sweater.
Okay.
Thanks, Anne.
Thanks, Johanna.